Okay, welcome to the third and final of this series of Exploring Climate Strategies, series of webinars centered around the book Against Doom. And we're having these conversations to try and figure out how can we put together a strategy and organize to protect our climate and raise up justice in the process. Tonight, we're talking about just transition. Very excited to have Richard Lipsitz, who will talk a little bit later, from Western New York area AFL-CIO, which he's the president, but they've done a amazing win-win experiment that he'll talk about a little bit later. And then we also have Jeremy Brecker, the author of Against Doom, and I'll say a little bit more about him, but just a couple notes before we go into the discussion, which is there's a study guide if you want to either read the book or watch the webinars and pull together a group, have a discussion. At the bottom of the YouTube video that you're watching now, this video will stay up there as a permanent resource. You can download the guide, pull together a group, and have a discussion group. Also, the publisher, PM Press, has said that if people want to get 5 copies or more, they'll give them half off. And you can get the information there also on the YouTube. And this series of talks is brought to you by the Labor Network for Sustainability and 350.org. And Jeremy Brecker is going to kick us off. And I'm just talking with Richard. Both of us, when we were young, read his labor history, the classic labor history, Strike. That's about the history of working people organizing. And that's how part of how I learned how ordinary people, when they get together and organize, can actually change the world and change their situation. And Jeremy's both a historian, but he's also writes about social movements, and he's also a participant. And this latest book he's done, Against Doom, it's interesting. And as a historian, Jeremy, you kind of look back, but with this book, you were kind of looking around you and seeing what's going on to address climate protection and weaving it together into what could be a viable strategy. And then I'm not sure what you call it when a historian starts to look into the future, but I think that's the intention here. And so let's, without any further ado, hear from Jeremy talking about how just transition fits into this. Jeremy?
Great. Thanks very much. And I want to thank both David and Emily, who's manning the controls or womaning the controls, and 350 and my organization, the Labor Network for Sustainability, for sponsoring this series of webinars. And I also very much want to thank Richard Lipsitz for being here with us and telling his quite extraordinary story of a project that he's been involved with, which we'll hear more about shortly. In the first 2 webinars, we talked overall about the strategy of what I call climate insurgency, and about the Public Trust Doctrine and the recently established right to a stable climate that have actually both been laid out by federal judge Ann Aiken in a recent case. And these are very important aspects of how we go about challenging climate change and challenging the institutions and the corporations and the governments that are preventing us from making the transition we have to make to climate safe energy. But today we're going to talk about one of the key problems that we all face when we start doing campaigns for shutting down power plants, for not building new pipelines, for legislation to move to a climate safe economy and climate safe energy system. And this is the problem that many people fear, that making that transition is going to threaten their jobs, their way of life, their livelihoods, and their communities. And that is something that is played up by the fossil fuel companies, who are always saying, almost as a mantra, that it's a question of jobs versus the environment. And if we protect the environment and protect the climate, we're going to be facing devastating economic consequences. And of course, this particular kind of scare was central to the campaign of President Trump, and central to the argument that he makes for going all out to expanding fossil fuel production and use. And so part of the struggle that we need to engage in is not just telling people the obvious reality that climate change threatens us all, but also to begin laying out an answer to the question, well, yes, but what's going to happen to my job if we abandon fossil fuels? I work in a coal mine, I work in a power plant, but also I work in a factory or an office or any kind of enterprise that is dependent on electricity and other things that are largely produced by fossil fuels. So we, whether we're coming from the labor movement or from the environmental side, or some of us who come from both, need to take head on the question of how do we protect working people from the possible consequences of a transition to a safe, climate-safe energy system. I'm going to talk about three dimensions of this. One is countering present injustice. The second is making the transition to a fossil-free energy system worker-friendly and worker-safe. And the third is more short-term in terms of our current campaigns, be they around pipelines, power plants, or alternative energy systems that will allow us to have energy without destroying the environment and destroying our communities. How do we protect workers in fossil fuel shutdowns? So why don't I just start by talking about the transition to fossil-free energy as an opportunity to counter the inequality, injustice, and discrimination that our society has in such extreme form now, and that in the Trump era, we are moving towards even more grotesque forms of inequality, injustice, and discrimination. This is a topic that we could talk about for a long time, and I've written about it a lot. You'll find a lot about it on the website of the Labor Network for Sustainability. But just to hit a few of the key things that we need to include in our vision and our plans and our legislation for climate protection. First of all, we're facing a situation where large parts of the population are excluded from the labor market, either entirely or excluded from the better jobs and forced to work in the worst paid, most menial, and most insecure ones. And one of the great things that's going to happen as we make the transition to climate safe, clean energy is that it's going to open a huge number of jobs, which if we insist that they're quality jobs and insist that they're made available to those who most need them because they've been excluded from the labor movement or discriminated against in the labor movement, this is a tremendous opportunity to begin rectifying the core discrimination and inequality that is, as former President Obama said, the critical issue of our era. It's also an opportunity to begin remedying the horrible pollution of environmental justice communities, of poor communities of color, inner city communities, in some cases, impoverished rural communities where the most destructive effects of fossil fuels, and asthma is the one that comes immediately to mind, are unjustly and unfairly concentrated. And we need to make the starting place for where we start shutting down the fossil fuel energy system and replacing it with a clean, safe energy system. Start out in those places that are most devastated by the local pollution that comes out of those power plants and mines and other fossil fuel facilities. We also need to have in mind the protection of low-income utility consumers. Many, many people face the choice of paying for their heat or paying for their rent, or if their heat is part of their rent and their cooling is part of their rent. It's a huge part, and it's a huge part of the housing and energy poverty that a substantial proportion of people, especially in inner city areas, face. And we need to, as we make a transition to clean energy, we need to make sure that there are programs such as maximum energy payments, or what sometimes called lifeline utility rates, that provide, for example, that no one should pay more than 30% of their housing cost for their utilities energy needs. And again, you will find very concrete proposals for how to do that. And there are places that are actually developing that kind of program at a state and municipal level. We also have total injustice in our other social services like transportation, housing, and the like, that discriminate against poor people, against people of color. And those systems also need to be transformed as part of reducing our energy costs and our energy waste. And that can be done in a way that also challenges our inequality and discrimination and injustice. Of course, there's masses of detail that could be given for each of those points, but these need to be front and center in what we think about when we think about how we're going to make that just transition. So the second part I want to talk about is those people who are in the fossil fuel economy, either as producers of fossil fuels or working in power plants and other facilities that use them, or people who are dependent on them because, for example, they work in a factory that is highly energy dependent and they're getting their energy from fossil fuels, or they use raw materials that are greenhouse gas releasers. And here, the thing to keep in mind, first of all, is that more jobs, in fact, far more jobs, are created by the clean energy transition than will be lost. And you can see that spelled out in many, many studies. We at Labor Network for Sustainability did one called The Clean Energy Future, Protecting the Climate, Creating Jobs, and Saving Money, which shows that the number of jobs that will be created is somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 times as many as those that might be threatened in going to a predominantly fossil-free economy. But it's crucial to remember that any job is important if it's your job. And people who feel threatened by the loss of their jobs are potentially perhaps unwillingly and unhappily, but they're candidates to be enemies of the change to a fossil-free economy, and they are vulnerable to being poster children for the Trumps and the fossil fuel companies that are always looking for an opportunity to exploit the potential vulnerability of working people as a way of putting them up as poster children for their claim that, oh, if you start restricting fossil fuels, you're going to cause mass unemployment and economic disaster for American workers. So the climate protection movement needs to partner with unions and working class organizations to create long-term strategies for a just transition for those workers. This is often talked about in terms of a GI Bill of Rights for workers who might be affected, whose jobs might be threatened by climate protection. At the end of World War II, there was tremendous worry about the economic impacts of demobilization and a peacetime economy. And the United States solved that problem in substantial part by creating a very large, very favorable benefit program for the returning World War II veterans that provided them in many cases up to 4 years of education and training, funding to start businesses, housing support, although that was extremely discriminatory in actual practice. But sectors of the returning veterans were able to buy houses on the GI Bill, while others were excluded. And there is a need for something very similar for those who might be harmed by the transition to a clean energy economy. If they're ready for retirement or close to it, they should receive decent pensions with health care. And there are very clearly laid out programs for doing this. In the state of Washington, the trade union movement is developing a plan for protecting laid off workers who might be threatened with these kinds of protections. There is a Clean Energy Workers Just Transition Act that was drawn up by Senator Sanders and Senator Merkley that incorporates many of the just transition provisions that have been advocated by a number of unions and by Labor Network for Sustainability and by many, many environmental organizations. But this gives them an opportunity to incorporate something concrete along these lines for the protection of their members. And it allows the environmental and climate protection movement to come forward as supporters and protectors of those whose jobs might be threatened, rather than as the source of that threat. So the final piece of this I want to talk about is what happens when the climate movement and the environmental movement start threatening, being perceived as threatening workers' jobs because they are saying that a power plant like the Keystone XL power plant, pipeline, and there are many, many struggles throughout the country now about other pipelines. So they say, and you can hear this in the media and the Trumps all the time, oh, the climate protectors and the environmentalists are threatening the jobs of the pipeline workers. Or if there's a movement to shut down, say, a coal-fired power plant, that they are threatening the livelihoods of the communities, of the workers in those plants and the communities around them. So let me just lay out a few pieces of how climate activists should be trying to reach out to and cooperate with workers and trade unions and labor organizations more broadly. There is a short book about this, interactive book. It's on the LNS website. It's called Jobs Beyond Coal, but it really applies to any kind of fossil fuel facility. And if you're facing a case where you're involved in an environmental or climate struggle and you are concerned that you may be coming up against people whose jobs may actually be threatened, or they may feel they're being threatened, I recommend you take a look at Jobs Beyond Coal, because it gives a lot of concrete advice. And I'll just mention a couple of the points. It's incredibly helpful not to wait until there is some crisis like a threatened power plant shutdown before you start trying to develop communications and relations with unions and trade union movement in your communities. There are many, many issues on which labor and environmentalists have common interests and can and have involved in common struggles. And where people have done that beforehand, it makes a huge difference in the ability to find some kind of cooperative relationship around things like a plant closing. And there was, just to give one example, there was a move to close a power plant in the state of Washington a few years ago. And the unions and who represented the workers in the plant and the environmental organizations were very much at loggerheads about this. But they had worked together a few years before in the struggle against the World Trade Organization Millennial Summit in Seattle. And so they had long-standing relations. And they were at loggerheads. The negotiations to find common ground broke down. And then some of the people who had been involved in that earlier struggle said, you know what, let's give it another try. And they sat down and began talking. And eventually they were able to actually negotiate a plan for the closing of that plant with support and cooperation of the unions representing the workers who were working there. A second key point, which is also illustrated in that example, is a starting point for discussion is for everyone, unions, environmentalists, politicians, to listen to the actual concerns of the workers who work in that plant, because they may not be what you would assume. In that particular case, the environmental movement had done a nice job of saying, we want jobs for all the people who are threatened in clean energy jobs, and we want to retrain them from clean energy jobs, which was a very good thing for them to say, but it turned out that it was almost entirely irrelevant. The reason is that many of the people who were working there were near retirement, and what they were most concerned about was what was going to happen to their retirement situation. And so the settlement that was made guaranteed good, secure retirements for that sector. And then this was a rural area with almost no decent jobs. And the other great concern was not individual workers having a new career, which they mostly didn't want to have, but that there be a way that their kids could get jobs in the local community. And so part of the settlement was that the company would support and develop local industries in that county that would employ local workers and would provide jobs in the producing the materials that were going to be used for their transition to a clean energy economy. Not to work in a power plant, but to work in a factory or other facility that was producing materials for that transition. And the third example I want to give here is that really any local environmental group could do, but we were was working with a group in Bridgeport that was trying to shut a power plant. And they said to the union, and they also looked at what people were doing elsewhere and said, okay, here's a proposed list of things that ought to be part of the just transition when we shut the power plant. And that included bidding rights for the workers to have other jobs. It included workers in the plant being able to have jobs in the cleanup and replacement of that power plant, and a variety of other things, 8 or 10 demands, including a union contract for specifying the rights that workers would have as the plant was closed. And that made a tremendous difference in the ability of the, wasn't just environmental groups, there was a whole coalition of inner city groups and environmental justice groups, and it created a situation where they were able to play a very different role in relation to the unions and the workers in the plant. So just to give a couple of other quick examples of the ways people have addressed this. Another crucial point is to try to find alternative economic development possibilities for the local communities that are going to be affected. So we did a study during the Keystone pipeline controversy, where we hired some economic development firm to go and develop a plan for alternative pipeline infrastructure that was needed in the states and even in the counties that were along the route of the KXL pipeline, and show how the people who worked doing pipelines, that was their craft, what they knew how to do and were able to do extremely well, could be making water pipelines and sewer pipelines, which were desperately needed, and it had proposals for where you get the money. So that's the kind of thing that could be repeated in any program of this kind. When their plants are closed, long before they're closed, we can develop community worker protection funds that collect money in advance, for example, by fees on the companies, and then replace taxes and invest in good local jobs. And Richard's going to talk about what's really a leading, pioneering example of that. So the thing that I would say as the end is this is something where the labor side, the worker side, on the one hand, and the environmental side, the climate side on the other, need to do basically two things. One is we need to recognize that we all have to make a living, and we all have to create a climate that's safe for all of us. And it's not, there's no one who is a worker but not someone who's threatened by climate change, and there's no one who is threatened by climate change who doesn't have to think about the problems that climate protection is going to make for workers. And so each side in these situations needs to take the initiative in reaching out to the other.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. And I'm going to say a few things, but before I do that, Richard, Emily put your mute on, so I'm wondering if you can tap your screen in on the lower left-hand corner, turn your sound back on, give us a thumbs up or thumbs down if you have it figured out or not. And for folks who have joined us, if you're having trouble watching, you can refresh your browser. And we're asking folks, as soon as Richard shares some of his wisdom with us, we're going to take questions and give answers. And so you can just do that in the chat in your YouTube account. Do we have sound yet, Richard?
I think so. Can you hear me?
You're perfect. And
all right, good.
So I'm really excited to hear from Richard about this thing called the Huntley Coalition, which is an experiment they did that I think our movement can learn a lot from him. Richard Lipsitz is the president of the Western New York area AFL-CIO. Thanks a lot for taking the time and joining us, Richard.
Well, thanks for asking me. This is a pleasure. I've never done anything like this before, and it's a very interesting experience. And I really enjoyed what the remarks that led into you asking me that question. And but thanks a lot for having me. Let's see. I want to just take off a little bit to start on Jeremy's point about building relationships. Both the environmental justice and the labor movement have common interests that if we work together, we can help solve this devastating problem of climate change that is hurting working class people more than anybody else. And we took up this problem, at least in a local sense, when a power plant shut down outside of Buffalo, New York, in a working class suburb called Tonawanda. The plant was called Huntley, you're right, and that's why we call it the Huntley Project or the Huntley Experiment. The question there was the impact on the community of the plant shutting down, the role that the plant's production played in providing a tax base for the community. And that's that question, when it shut down, became one of serious importance. The tax base would have been eroded, was eroded by the shutdown of this plant by a significant amount of money that would have led to the closing of four public schools, perhaps the merger of the public school system, the layoff of 150 teachers, the layoff of other municipal employees. So the union that represented the workers in the Kenmore Tonawanda school district came to the Labor Federation and asked for help. And this is what this was all about. This is what this was all about. That's where the beginning of this project came from. We didn't know what to do as a Labor Federation, except we thought that it might be a good idea to work with an environmental justice group in the community that was involved in that Tonawanda community, and work with them to figure out how can we keep this shutdown from devastating the tax base of this community. The question of the workers in the old plant was somewhat mute because the plant had been shutting down over a period of time, and there weren't that many workers left in the plant. It was really a question more than anything else of what do you do to replace a large amount of money to losing their jobs, like as I said before, in the school district and in other civil servant positions, and to keep the town from raising taxes so that the ratepayers would end up paying more in property tax, or the consumers would pay more in rate increases for the energy that was coming out of the plant. Now, this one took us into work with the industrial unions in the region, because the area around the power plant is the most heavily industrialized section of Western New York. Western New York, Buffalo, is still one of the more important industrial sections of the United States. Our industrial workforce is about 12% of the population, which is down considerably since its heyday when it was 33%, but it's still about 25%, 33% rather, higher than the national average. So we still have an industrial manufacturing base in the town. The industrial users, if their rates go up, they're going to start agitating with the unions that represent the workers there to take concessions in their labor agreements. Otherwise, they'll move into a place, some other part of the country or some other part of the world for that matter, where their taxes aren't as high. So we had this double whammy that we were trying to deal with. We engaged with the Clean Air Coalition of Western New York, made an alliance with the Kenmore teachers, had discussions with the IBEW, had the workers in the plant, had discussions with the industrial unions, the UAW and the steelworkers, and engaged in a program to try to pressure New York State to pass legislation that would allow for tax assistance to be given to communities where fossil fuel plants shut down and the tax base is significantly eroded. It took about a year and a half or 2 years of some really intense struggle inside of our coalition and then outside of the coalition with the lobbying the state government. But we were able to lobby and pass the Fossil Fuel Closure Act of 2015, which provided for money for the community of Tonawanda and kept school teachers, policemen from being laid off, garbage collectors from being laid off, and all the other civil servants, white collar as well, from being laid off, school districts from being either merged or shut down considerably, and all the attendant problems that that has in a community that is, again, a highly working class community. So we were successful. And now we are in the stage of working to find an economic development plan with the town supervisor and the town council that will backfill good jobs that are environmentally safe, we hope, that pay good wages and benefits, that have union neutrality, that have promotional opportunities, that have a hiring policy that seeks to diversify the workforce, and all the other things that we think are important in a job and in industry that can revive this town so that its tax base isn't wiped out 5 years from now when this fossil fuel, or 7 years rather, when this fossil fuel money is no longer available through the state of New York. And I think we're moving forward on that as well. So I just talked to you a lot about what happened over about really it's about a 3-year period, and which we're still involved in. But the lessons are exactly as along the lines of what Jeremy laid out earlier. Working together with an environmental group that understands that transition away from fossil fuels should not be borne on the working people. We did not create this problem. It was created by a fossil fuel industry that frankly has been running our country in large measure for a long, long time and doesn't want to give up the economic benefits from that. And obviously it helped the current president get elected. So it doesn't want to give up the political benefits from that lead to things like incentives and industrial advances, money for the fossil fuel industry. How do we work together to address the questions that are brought on by the necessary switchover from energy sources which are destroying not the planet, are destroying human beings on the planet. Planet itself, I think, would survive without human beings, one way or the other. We weren't here before. We're not going to be here forever. But actually, that deals with the problems that human beings are going through by the overuse of these fuels, which are destroying and causing the climate change, which has devastating impact all over the world. How do we actually work together so that the working class people are not the ones who pay for this transition, and that it leads to all the positives that Jeremy described for that same working class community? That's the question, I think, that has to be addressed and has to be struggled with, and then real life attempts have to be made to address this in a way that I just described. And that's sort of the way I was looking at. That's the reason I'm excited to be on this call, this webinar, and I hope we can have some further discussion. But that's the story in a thumbnail, in a short sketch.
Thank you, Richard. That was a great example. I'm gonna read questions off of the YouTube screen and invite anyone who'd like to hear from either Jeremy or Richard to ask questions and let us know where you're from. I'm starting with Luke Grossmiller from 350 Eugene, Oregon. She says, it seems solar energy will be very limited in winter months. So how will there possibly be enough renewable green energy to replace fossil fuels?
Well, I'll take a first stab at it. The overall strategies that are developed for making the large scale change to fully renewable energy are based on the fact that different forms of energy and exist in different locations. And that's why actually, while local forms of energy are very important, also hooking them up. So the areas where you have huge amounts of wind are sources of energy for the places where solar is not as viable in other regions. However, let me also say that relative to the question, that my understanding is that the amount of solar energy that's available is colossal relative, for example, to even the present energy use of the United States, that it's tens and tens and tens times more energy available just on existing rooftops and potential solar gardens and so on. While there's a lot to be done by compensating between solar, wind, geothermal, and so on, it's also true that even in most areas in winter, there's going to be plenty of solar if it's developed seriously and if energy efficiency is applied. And one place you can see that is in Germany, where very, very large proportion of the electric energy is now supplied by solar, even though I haven't been there, but as I understand it, you're talking about a country that is socked in with clouds a very, very big part of the time, especially in winter. And Richard, I know you have more things to say about the German example.
Well, after we did this work in Tonawanda, we got invited over by the Rockefeller Family Foundation and the German environmental wing, political wing rather, the Green Party, the environmental wing of the Green Party, and we were able to tour the country, and we saw how they've transitioned away from, especially coal, and they've done this, and at the same time they still have a very active industry that produces steel, makes steel, and does auto manufacturing, and they do it in a way that they use renewable energy sources, not completely, but to a large extent, to power the steel plants and the automobile plants. So if they could solve the problem there, and you're right, solar, wind, I saw both those things in a large number of examples. If they can do it there, there's no reason the United States of America can't do it, except a political one and an economic one. And that's where the rubber meets the road, to be able to fight through this crazy analysis coming from the White House and from others on the right, that it's a hoax, that climate change is a hoax. Nobody believes that. And I don't think they actually believe it either. I think they're just protecting the economic interests that have gotten them as far as they've gone, and they don't want to switch that over, and the world be damned. So I think that's really what's at stake. The German national economy is making this transition. It's not without problems. We heard about those too, and finding jobs for people is always a problem in a situation like this. But at least there's a recognition on the part of the government and the political parties over there. Even the center-right parties in Germany understand that climate change, global warming is not, and it has to be addressed soon and in a significant and sustained fashion. We don't have that. We don't have that political will in this country. It was closer when the former President Obama was there than it is today, but we're just not in that position yet. So that's an added dimension to the struggle. We've got to solve this question, and we've got to do it in a way that puts, as I said earlier, puts the working class people in the forefront, and forces a transition to be made that doesn't come on the backs of ordinary working people, but is paid for by those who, frankly, can afford it the most. And I think we can do that. I think there's a lot of not just jobs, but money to be made in switching over. And if it's plowed back into the society, it can make a tremendous difference, as you said earlier, Jeremy, in the living standards of working class communities. And I think that's the direction that we. And if we don't, I think we're helping the world go down a path that, while I'm not an alarmist about this stuff, I get it. This is pretty damn serious, and we'd better deal with it, and deal with it now, and until we can actually solve it. I got children and grandchildren. We didn't create this mess, but I certainly don't want to sit back and just let it happen. I'll say that.
Thanks for that, Richard, and thanks for the question, Luke. And Luke is from Eugene, where there's a whole group sitting around a church watching this webinar together. Thank you for joining us. A couple more questions from Albanius. One is, where is it? In upstate New York, the big fossil fuel issues are not coal and gas, but oil pipelines, as well as plants and compressor stations. So I'm just going to ask either of you to respond to that, and maybe throw this also at Richard. Richard, if folks watching are part of a local climate justice or environmental or community group that's trying to address a fossil fuel facility, what's some steps they might take to try and do it in common cause with workers and unions?
Well, that's a good question, and that's one which I think we need to take a look at. Everybody does. Establish relationships. Don't just go and lecture the union leaders who have workers in these plants about how dangerous the plants are, or how bad they are for the ecology or for the world's environment, but actually establish a relationship with the organized workers in a plant. And I think through their unions, we have a highly unionized section of New York State, and join together. And without lecturing about climate change being real. By the way, I don't have a single person on the executive board of the Western New York Area Labor Federation who doesn't believe this is a real problem. That isn't the issue. The issue is, how do we make common cause that, as I said a couple times now, that doesn't take this problem and make ordinary workers pay for it, including the workers in the plants? How do we work together in order to find our way to a better economy? I have nothing. I couldn't be more clear on that, as far as I'm concerned. As far as I think the objective situation is, the environmental movement and the labor movement have a lot in common, and we should take that as the starting point and work towards solving this problem together, instead of taking the starting point, one which essentially drives us a wedge between us. That does nobody any good. Tony Mazzocchi was the first person I ever heard use the term just transitions. He was the health and safety director for OCAW, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And he spent a lot of time in Niagara Falls, New York. In fact, he told us it was one of his favorite places. it's it's where Love Canal is, or was, still is actually, where lots of chemical plants are. Tony took the position that we have to figure out ways to transition away from polluting plants into clean ones. That take is the first thing. What are the concerns of the workers in the plant, and what are the concerns of the communities that are around the plant and where the workers live and work and play and recreate? And I think that's I mean, it sounds simple, but establish the relationship before issuing letters to the editor and editorials. Talk to people. And I just think it's common sense to do so, and that's the way we should be doing it. And that goes for us too. That goes for the labor movement as well. We can't just assume everybody is a quote doesn't care about the impact on workers' jobs. I don't think that's a fair generalization any more than I think it's a fair generalization that all working class leaders only care about improving their own living standards and working conditions for their members. Both parties have a broader sense of the world, and we ought to take advantage of that and work together against those who've created this situation.
And I want to add just one thing for local activists. It's very easy when there's a strike or another labor action where there's a picket line to just go and join the picket line.
Yeah.
You have an opportunity to talk to people, and you have an opportunity completely divorced from any suspicions that people may have of you because you're maybe threatening their job. On the contrary, showing up and joining a picket line for a group of workers whose livelihood is being threatened by their bosses is an awfully good way to start building those relationships.
I agree.
Thanks for both that. In the San Francisco Bay Area, the climate justice movement has been out to Martinez supporting steel workers on strike. And the fun thing is we use the same signs we use in the anti-fracking demonstrations, which is stand up to big oil on the refinery workers. Pretty happy about that. There's a question from Rhonda. Have you mentioned the dark money trail, the groups pitting workers against climate activists?
It's definitely addressed in actually two of my books as very important, critical aspect of the whole story, and is a critical part of how workers are turned against climate protectors and environmentalists. So I think that's a very, very good and relevant point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about exactly the details on all these questions, but it just strikes me that this is not just a national question; it's an international question. If you look around the world, and I'm quite suspicious of the connections between the Russian oil oligarchs and the people who are running our country today. And you talk about dark money and devious intentions. I think you can make an argument that they ended up putting the guy in the White House who's in the White House today, who's a threat to all of us.
Yes. Question, will this presentation be available online for viewing later? And yes, this at this YouTube site, this will become a permanent video that will be available that folks can share. Wanted to myself expand on the last question about fossil fuel industry consciously playing off workers and environmental justice groups. And I'd like to tease out from either of you, Jeremy or Richard, what are things that either folks on the labor side or the climate side can do to prevent against being played off against each other? How can we organize, frame, build relationships? What can we do so that they can't do that?
Well, let me just say that I'll just use the example that I just described earlier, is engage and struggle together. It's the way that we always learn, and analyze a situation. I would never pretend to tell people who have conditions that are different than the one I described the proper tactics to take up. I think that'd be rather intrusive. I think it's better to identify a problem and then work from that. And in doing so, reaching out to the labor organizations that exist in your community and talking to them about what their concerns are. And that's the way this, I don't know about this dark money or exactly, other than what we just talked about. The going to organizations that have real skin in the game and saying, okay, how can we work together, is a pretty damn good place to start.
So let me just add, in the state that I live in, which is Connecticut, we created a roundtable on climate and jobs, which is co-anchored by the state AFL-CIO and the Interreligious Task Force on Environmental Justice, and involves a bunch of other organizations as well. And one of the things that we got involved with was when the utilities in the state wanted to raise the distribution portion of the utility bill by 65% in one jump. And the reason they wanted to do that was to make a disincentive for people to be energy efficient and insulate their homes and solarize their homes. And we developed a coalition that involved the unions and the poor communities who were going to be hit very hard by this rate increase, and of course the environmental groups and various others, and build a working coalition around this that not only managed to block this rate increase, but managed to put a cap on increases in the distribution, a cap on the distribution fee, like the one that they have in California. That was our model. That meant a substantial reduction in the distribution fee that the utilities could charge. So it's just one example of the way you can find common ground and issues to work around.
Yeah, and just to that point, that's the common ground we had in Tonawanda was the impact on the tax base. That's what brought us all together. How do we stop teachers from being laid off? How do we stop, as I said before, civil servants from being laid off because of a shutdown of a fossil fuel plant? That became the paramount question that led to the unity between the industrial workers, the utility workers, the public sector workers, and the environmental justice group. That's how we did it. So we found again, we came to a common, identified a common goal. And I think, that's sort of an ABC organizing question, but I think it's an important one to remember.
Thank you, Richard. Just a short question from Traven Leishon, which is, if this is available online, I'd like to post it to our Labor Council page. And Traven, you can just post the same URL that you're watching now on YouTube. And we're at about time. I'd like to invite Richard and Jeremy, if you have any closing thoughts or like to share any resources for people working in the labor movement and the climate justice movement who want to pursue this work so we can win justice and protect our climate.
Well, I'm going to bow to Jeremy on this. I just want to thank you for having me on this, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk about the experience that we had and we're having.
We've been putting really everything that we can find and a lot of material that we've generated ourselves on this topic on the website of the Labor Network for Sustainability. For example, you'll find an article that was written by Richard and another, and indeed one of his environmental partners,
right, about
the Huntley experiment on the LNS website. And we do a newsletter that includes a lot of case studies and examples of these kinds of things, as well as my little book on jobs against coal. And so that is www.labor4sustainability.org. Labor number 4, sustainability, or obviously you can find it on Google or a search engine. And I would encourage people who are either just interested or facing this kind of thing and trying to figure out how to deal with it. You'll find a lot of useful material there.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you, Richard. I want to thank Emily Jove, who's been producing this webinar. And this is David Solnit. I'm an arts organizer with 350.org. And thank you very much, everyone, for watching.
Thanks.
Thanks.